So we're here, and we're ready for an adventure, 8 meters below the surface. And an adventure is what it really is, because for the first time, television cameras are going to show you a part of Canada's military history that's been buried for almost a century.
And the Germans actually didn't know what hit them. They didn't realize.
We are beneath the battlefields of Vimy, walking in the footsteps of Canada's soldier. It's been 100 years since the start of the Great War, and still so much to discover. Fears never spoken, heroism still entombed in time. Tonight, we unearth some of those stories, because for every one of the hundreds of thousands of Canadians who served, there was a path, there is a story. Good evening, I'm Peter Mansbridge. On this Remembrance Day, the personal journey of Canada's soldier in World War I. The journey of boys who became men, of men who grew old before their time, and of those for whom time simply ran out. We're coming to you tonight from inside Soldiers' Tower at the University of Toronto. It is a memorial to some of those who were lost in the Great War. All of those who served are gone now, of course, but as you'll find tonight, their stories live on. This one begins here with the charm, the romance of Prince Edward Island. 100 years ago, it was war that could intoxicate too. Frank Walker is 20 years old, a machinist with little talent for tools, but proficient with a pen.
Since the outbreak of war, 4 long, unendurable days ago, I've been on pins and needles. Will they take me? That's the question. Thank heaven. All fears are over now. I have passed, fit for active service.
From the offices and workshops of the great cities, from the surf-beaten shores of the Maritimes.
Indeed, they enlist all across the country, those born in Canada, like Walker, and many who were not. Men like James Lloyd Evans. He grew up in Wales, but by 1914 he's raising a family, running a hardware store in small-town Manitoba. And men like John Pollard's Girvan. He came from Scotland as a kid, becomes a star athlete in Toronto, a bachelor who goes from postal clerk to private with the flourish of a pen.
The plain of Valcartier, almost virgin wilderness, had been transformed as if by magic into a great military camp.
The Canadian Expeditionary Force mobilizes here, a new military camp transformed out of the woods and farmers' fields of Valcartier, Quebec. Walker, the keen young islander, documents every moment.
This is the life. We go every day on long route marches over the hills and come back tired, hungry, and inconceivably happy. Fresh troops are pouring in every day. The clamor of drums and bugles and bagpipes can be heard at all hours.
Bagpipes, the Highlanders of the 15th Battalion, including Girvan, also arrive. A total of 31,000 make up that first contingent, many, like Walker, impatient to set off.
Everything is ready now. We will probably go to England for further training. The war appears to be progressing slow enough. Hope it doesn't wind up before we get across.
Such enthusiasm to get to battle. The gulf between expectation and reality hard to believe now. But back in the fall of 1914, it seems like the beginning of something thrilling. And of course, for many, the chance to serve king and country.
We break camp this morning and train for Quebec and board the SS Mégantic, one of the great fleet of ocean liners which is to take across Canada's First Army. Everybody happy.
That great fleet, 30 ships strong, an unprecedented, remarkable sight as it steams out into the Atlantic. Both Walker and Girvan happen to be assigned the same ship. two men with little in common. The brawny Highlander headed for the infantry, and the wordsmith from Charlottetown, now with the Field Ambulance Corps. But both destined for history.
The Armada, escorted by British warships, headed into the Atlantic en route for England.
2 weeks later, the first large contingent from one of Britain's overseas dominions is here, Salisbury Plain, in the shadow of the mystical Stonehenge. The Canadians prepare and practice, etching a new chapter on these historical lands.
Tents, cookhouses, and all the camp paraphernalia are already here, but there are no sidewalks, no electric lighted huts for reading and recreation, no picture shows. Nothing that would allow us for 1 minute to forget what we're here for. War training.
They endure months of marches, musketry, demanding field exercises. And an unexpected hardship too, one that has them looking almost eagerly to France.
The weather continues favorable for ducks, but for us, miserable, shivering, half drowned, living in a state of unabating mud-soaked misery. It seems that however bad the front may be, it can't be so bad after all.
It rains 89 days the Canadians are at Salisbury, the coldest, soggiest winter in 2 generations. And as they set off for the front, it rains yet again. Walker is relieved to go.
Marching orders at last.
Less than 6 months pass, and already a second Canadian contingent is mobilized. Among them, an officer named James Lloyd Evans, pulled to serve by a sense of duty. By then, Ottawa has grumbled to the War Office about conditions at Salisbury. So Evans and others land here, on the coast, Shorncliffe Camp, near Folkestone. Evans writes home.
My darling wife, I think we are mighty lucky getting here and into such good quarters, especially after what those poor devils at the first contingent had to put up with.
These are the Napier Barracks at Shorncliffe, built in the late 1800s. This one is actually built in 1899. Originally, the idea was for the British Army, of course, but by 1914, the Brits were already gone. They were at the Western Front, and these barracks, for the most part, were empty, but not for long. That's when the Canadians started arriving, by the thousands, the tens of thousands, actually, and they filled up each one of these in no time at all. In fact, they kept stretching through using the parkland for miles down the road, tents. That's where the Canadians were housed.
My darling girl, it may mean that I shall be kept here for some time. I know you'll like that, but it isn't what I came here for.
Tell us about him. What was this man like?
He was a soldier through and through, and a great family man, a deep sense of loyalty and love to his wife and children. But overriding that, one gets the feeling that he was a soldier before all else.
Michael George is passionate about local military history, and he wants the story of the Canadians here told, who they were and why they came, including the story of a young Jim Evans.
You read his letters, and they're really painful in places. He talks about not being able to face friends who are over here, friends who've been to the front, but he hasn't. And some of us might think that perhaps that was fortunate. You would jump at the chance for a safe billet, but not Jim. He pestered and pestered his senior officers to let him have a chance to go to the Western Front.
And so for Evans, escalating discomfort. He remains but longs to join the soldiers from the first contingent, and now the second contingent, set off for France. That momentous crossing, as the white cliffs of Dover slip from view, I have to wonder what they were feeling. Fear, duty, or maybe thoughts of glory in war. Safe to say, it was a journey unlike anything we can imagine today. It doesn't take long for the reality to hit. It's life and death in dank, bloody trenches. John Girvin is proving himself in the infantry. The private is quickly promoted to corporal. And Frank Walker toils as a stretcher bearer. When a soldier goes down, that's when he goes in, often under fire. April 1915. Both are near Ypres, Belgium. A time, a place, warfare changes forever. Walker documents a growing panic.
Excitement is rising to a frenzy. No one seems to know exactly what is going on. The wounded who have come in report a terrible engagement taking place near St. Julien, in which we are distinctly getting the worst of it.
Today, the brooding soldier memorial stands in St. Julien, its imposing presence like a keeper watching over the dead.
The Third Battle of Ypres, or the Battle of Passchendaele, was done by Canadians.
And our local guide, Freddie de Klerk, a keeper of sorts of that history. So we're talking March, April 1915. The Canadians get here. How ready are they for what's about to happen?
Nobody was ready for a new weapon. So they came here, and it was a quite quiet region. The Canadians were on this side. The Germans, who were about 1.5 kilometers further on, they started already since months with putting bottles, cylinders with chlorine in it, over a distance of 6,000 meters, 6 kilometers, about 6,000 of those bottles. And when the wind was coming from the north, from there, then they opened all the gas bottles and the chlorine was coming over the battlefield. So they were not prepared for that.
Now, when you said the Canadians weren't ready for a new weapon and gas, when you say they weren't ready, they didn't have gas masks, they had nothing.
No, they had to use the handkerchief and pee on it, and then you had ammoniac and you could smell on it. And this was the first gas mask that has been used. This was the only possibility.
You know, even in a gentle rain, it's easy to be fooled by the calmness and the beautiful serenity of a memorial garden like this. Because it was on these same grounds that thousands of Canadians gasped for their last breath during the gas attacks. What was it like? Well, here we go to the words of our friend, Private Frank Walker, because he was here and he wrote about it in his daily journals. Like this, April 23rd, 1915. Delivered rations this morning as usual. The 10th Division of the Ambulance Corps is stationed here. The wounded are pouring in by the hundreds. Those who could walk have limped as best they could from the trenches. Others crawl in, helped by comrades. The roads are blocked with ambulance cars. Wounded men are lying on stretchers outside the dressing station, along the high road, in fields, and on the doorsteps of houses. Doctors and orderlies are working as quickly as possible, but the queues of waiting wounded are steadily growing longer and more unmanageable. Kind of the desperate moments that must have faced those Canadians 100 years ago. Desperate, but somehow they hang on. And then, as hard as it is to imagine, the battle gets uglier. Walker assumes the worst.
It is feared our infantry regiments have been annihilated.
Among those trying to hold the line against the Germans, the Highlander, John Girvan. His 15th Battalion suffers the heaviest of all the Canadian units, 647 casualties in a single day. But he survives, in fact, distinguishes himself, and is commissioned as an officer shortly afterward.
Can you tell me anything about, if not him in particular, what these guys were like as fighters?
They were very good soldiers, because even with a new weapon that has been used in the gas attack, the chlorine, they even managed to come back to fight again, to regroup, to do whatever they had to do.
Canada's first major engagement of the Great War is heroic, but also horrific, and it's only just begun. For every step Canada's soldier takes on the battlefields of Europe, there's a good chance somebody is holding their breath back home. Canada isn't just where they waited and worried, it's where they would keep the memories alive. 100 years later, they still do. Georgetown, Ontario, unassuming, peaceful. For John Girvan, about as far as you can get from the chaos of the war. For his granddaughter, it's home too. But Marty Mears has no memory of the man who, with time, became larger than life.
My image of him? Very strong, stature. All I know is that he seemed to stand out from the others. He wasn't afraid. He just would get out there and do it. If you die, you die. It's part of war. He didn't let it hold him back.
She's right. On the battlefield, any field really, Girvan never holds back. On the front, he's promoted regularly, an acting major by the time Canadians are engaged in the Somme offensive of 1916. Mears remembers an old family story of her granddad's bravery in battle.
He took a hill and he led his troops from the front, and he went down the hill and somebody shot him, a German shot him. So he just kept going down the hill, and from what I was told, he beat the guy up pretty good before he passed out. He was shot right in the chest.
Indeed, Girvan's service records reveal just how seriously he's wounded and the toll 20 months of fighting has taken. Doctors report his nerves shaken and he needs prolonged rest. The hero is human. Still, chroniclers of military history begin to take notice of Girvan, of the battle that felled him. They write,
"Then along behind the trench came Major Girvan and the pair of black-headed fighting bombers. They had a wild few minutes picking off the Hun leaders. Major Girvan was truly magnificent."
Now, in the movie version of this war story, there'd be a love interest. And sure enough, in real life, there is.
I didn't know the whole thing. I was told by my sister that my grandfather and grandmother met in France. And they were both just on leave and bumped into each other, started talking, and next thing you knew, they were a romance.
Jean Elizabeth Sword is a skilled nurse from Owen Sound. He is now a decorated officer, superstar on the battlefield. Clearly a match only the Great War could conjure.
She was very into the war and it was just something she felt she needed to do too, and that's probably why they connected so well.
But a match the Great War could also take away. Jim Evans was already sacrificing great love in the name of service, waiting at home, a wife and 3 children, their only connection, his letters home.
Gran died in 1969, and when my aunt was packing up her belongings, she found a suitcase full of the letters and all these other albums and things, and she couldn't bear to look at them at all.
Susan Evans is Jim's granddaughter. As she read the newly found letters, she learned a lot.
I'm too busy just now training the men in musketry and further...
The clinical details of his life as an officer.
At 9 o'clock, there is a lecture in a sort of school building at which we take notes in a rough notebook.
And the intimate feelings of a man missing his family.
Fondest love to you and the bairns, your loving Jim. What I think about often is Gran. I think she would have been rather embarrassed, I think, to have had the letters made public. They were private letters. Well, girl, I need not say how I shall be looking forward to your letters. No more this time. With fondest love to you and the kiddies, your loving hubby, Jim. But you get an idea of some of the tone of what she had written. You know, one of them, you say, I don't love you enough. Of course, I love you, I love you, I love you. You know, it's so human.
And of course, that painful, recurring theme.
I don't care to be going among all my old friends again without having been at the front.
And finally, he in March of 1918, he took a drop in rank to captain because they had an overabundance of officers at the front. And then he got to go to the front. And I'm sure it was over my grandmother's objections.
I feel more like writing now I'm over on this side. It was the very devil having to say I was still in England. Do you know, Kitty, haven't had my clothes off for 17 days, and during the time in the line, 6 days not even boots off. I'm lousy and have either got the itch or scabies. Apart from that, everything okay.
At the time, I thought, oh, you fool. How could you? How could you? But nevertheless, it was king and country. So many of them signed up feeling it was going to be an adventure.
Turns out Captain Jim Evans' wartime adventure is just beginning. There's hardly a community in Canada without a war memorial. But 100 years ago, honoring Canada's soldier meant tucking away scraps of paper mailed home. In Charlottetown, it's the prose and poetry a stretcher bearer writes on the battlefield. Today, Frank Walker's war journal is preserved here at the Provincial Archives and in a book edited by his daughter.
We loaf around the aid post on the sandbags in the sun, taking the jeers and sneers of every passing son of a gun.
Mary Goody recites the verses flawlessly, the cadence perfect, because she's heard the poem so many times.
And then some bloody morning, when the skies are blazing red.
Still, she has a strong sense of what he must have braved, the journal entries vivid, but more somber as the months pass.
It kind of makes me fill up because I can't read a lot of it without feeling very sad.
Grave digging this morning, in the little bit of God's acre behind the dressing station. We have planted maple seeds here, and someday it will be beautiful.
That long ago thirst for adventure, that little bit of cheek from the young man who joked about ducks having it better than soldiers in the rain, it all seems to leave Walker's writing.
It's very evident, like the transition, yes, yeah, from this all young, agog person, and then to, there's nothing much there to excite a person anymore. It boggles my mind, and I'm his daughter. No, I don't think anybody, I think you would have to experience it, like to,
A century later, experiences that live on because of words scrawled on a battlefield.
The whole of Vimy Ridge is ours now, they say. There are a great many dead in the shell holes, and many more, I suppose, buried amid debris and dugouts.
And at Vimy, history that will also be documented in the most remarkable way. Vimy Ridge, one place, two little words, countless Canadian stories. Yes, our stretcher bearer, Frank Walker, is there, and as many as 100,000 others, all on the cusp of making history. This is what it's all about. A piece of high ground rising from the escarpment. Today, the Canadian Memorial at Vimy Ridge stands tall. A majestic nod to what happened here on April 9th, 1917. Every day, Canadian tourists walk these steps, a pilgrimage to remember the past. To visit the trenches from a century ago, to see how close the Germans and the Canadian lines were.
Pits are just through there.
We venture here, still on park grounds, but off the tourist track, to be among the first in nearly a century to follow in some remarkable Canadian footsteps. Footsteps down, deep underground, 8 meters into a hidden world below.
I'm going to release you from the rope.
Okay. No well-worn path here, just a fragile tunnel never before documented for network television.
Peter, we're in the main subway now, so
now we're into it. The entrance is done.
Yeah.
Goodman Subway, as it's known, is all raw, chalky walls, and not all that long ago, caved-in passages until excavated by experts.
As we come off to our left here, we're coming into mortar pits.
Nick Pryor of the Durand Group, the world's foremost authority on subterranean warfare, is our guide.
And this is just what they would have seen.
This is just what they would have seen, Peter, yes.
Goodman, he tells us, is actually one of more than a dozen tunnels in the area and one of the longest below the Vimy battlefront.
Going away into the distance there.
Right.
That's the main subway. You're looking probably 100 meters.
1,600 meters long, in fact. A century ago, a network of these subways and tunnels filled with Canadian men, becoming a key part of military strategy.
See, we've had timbers cut in, Peter.
All right.
Connecting reserve lines to the front lines, quickly, safely, and out of sight of the Germans. War underground, raging right alongside the war above ground.
Give me a sense of what would have been happening in this area on the big night in April 8th, 17. What would have been happening here?
Well, on the big night, the men would have been coming up quickly to here to use these accesses off the site, off the sides, to get up into the jumping off trenches. As they came up through these tunnels, they would have been hearing the shells and the artillery whistling overhead, feeling nervous, I'm sure. Perhaps
So
sick.
8 meters, no trouble hearing those shells.
No trouble hearing that at all.
So a lot of tension, a lot of nerves,
Absolutely.
about to make the big move.
Yeah.
These tunnels used also to conceal ammunition stores, communication lines, command posts, and more.
They're actually cables. They're electric cables. They are mine charge cables. So at the end of these would be the explosives they would use to blow the big craters on the surface and fire the electric current along. So this is very much part of this underground warfare.
So at the other end of this, trenches.
The other end of this, trenches. And the Germans actually didn't know what hit them. They didn't realize that we had so many men sitting in these subways ready to move forward on that morning of the 9th of April.
Hard to imagine so many men down here a century ago, yet as we continue, the damp emptiness slowly begins to reveal signs of life.
Peter, just to your left, see the can on the floor? The big...
Yes.
So that's the typical fuel cans, but they use that to bring water to the troops.
And what do we got here? Food tins?
Typical food tins. That strikes me as typical of a butter tin.
Then, even more extraordinary, drawings, carvings, and names. An exceptional number of names.
Peter, now we're really in a special place. We're right up on the front line, and if we just look to your right now, across the wall, I haven't found anything like this anywhere else in the tunnels. It is fantastic. Just brilliant. Lot of graffiti from all the soldiers that have been sitting down here in this subway.
And these appear to be, many of them, if not all of them, Canadians.
They're nearly all Canadian.
It was almost a century ago. The writing looks almost like it was yesterday. But no, it was 1917, 1918, some of the names. Here we got J.A. Hope, 2nd Canadian Mounted Rifles. He's from Victoria, BC. J.B. Thompson, 5 CMR. We got here D. Ross, 2nd Canadian Mounted Rifles. And C.H. Bamborough, 2nd CMR, Canada. You try to imagine what must have been going through their minds in those moments before they may have had to go up, and perhaps did, as they scratched their names and their regiments on the wall.
Hearts pounding, maybe thinking this could be the last vestige of me leaving a name on the wall. But it just epitomizes this war underground, this living, fighting, moving. It was a whole lifestyle here. It wasn't just a static warfare that everybody thinks of the First World War. Men were living down here. There were braziers down here. They were eating down here. They had to go to the toilet down here. All right?
Yeah. Okay.
I was so lucky, so privileged to get involved here, because every bit of tunnel you go in, every bit of name, there's a story.
There is no way anybody today can truly understand what Canada's soldier of the Great War endured. The horrors of battle, the cramped, desperate spaces that filled everyday life, and the courage it took just to go on. But in this tunnel, on this day, I probably got closer than most.
All right.
A long old day for you.
Yeah, don't step back. One of those days you never forget, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Quite amazing. Never been anything like that. No.
The Vimy Memorial honors every one of Canada's soldiers killed in the Great War, including those with no known grave. As for those who carry on, the Great War is still far from over, but the adventure they signed up for is long gone.
And Vimy brings us back to our friend Private Frank Walker and his writings in his journal. You know, he was here for the Great Battle of April 1917, but within a few months, he stopped writing. He'd just had enough, and this is the way he put it in one of his final diary entries under the heading of Rambling Notes. My war journal has come to an end. I grew tired of making notes on every trivial occasion, and the novelty of writing about active service can no longer inspire my efforts. Old, historic scenes or great bustling cities had now lost much of their charm and interest. Where are all the merry, carefree crew that made the old training days a brilliant piece of romance? Where are the comrades we tented with on the windy plains? Many of them have found their graves in France and Flanders. Many are in hospitals, maimed or dying.
Some few are well enough left as I am left, but we seem to have grown old before our time, and we do not enjoy the companionship even of ourselves. All are gone, the old familiar faces. In the aftermath of Vimy, Canada's soldier is fighting as part of a complete, identifiable unit. John Girvin is among those counted on the most. Frank Walker is war-weary, but still taking care of the wounded. And Major Jim Evans is now Captain Evans. The historic center of Arras, renowned for its architecture and fought over through the ages. By the summer of 1918, it is burned and broken, a victim of its proximity to the fighting. But the Canadians, including Evans, are advancing.
Well, sweetheart, I imagine you'll see all about it in the papers. I'm of the opinion that the next show the Canadians get into will be some show.
The Canadians enter towns like Monchy-le-Preux. The Caribou Monument today, a testament to a bloody sacrifice by the Newfoundland Regiment earlier in the war. It's where we meet up with battlefield expert Simon Godley.
And on the 26th of August 1918, as the Canadian Corps, now a corps, starts its great advance towards Mons, this is going to be one of the first villages they are going to retake. And of course, this has an impact for everybody, really.
The next few months see some of the fiercest engagements of the entire war. If Vimy is pivotal, the final 100 days are epic.
Those who have known graves, certainly for the last few months of the war, are scattered out here along this road. And you can trace almost every Canadian regiment from Arras to Cambrai. They all fought here.
And you can trace that 100-day battles.
Oh, yes.
By going from cemetery to cemetery.
By cemetery to cemetery, because now we're talking a war of movement.
Cemetery to cemetery, no way to avoid it. And hard not to think back to where this journey began. For me, those training grounds in England. And for Canada's soldier, with enthusiasm for adventure and in defense of king and country. So many destined not to make it this far. For those who did, the end game within reach. And now to the final chapters of the Captain Jim Evans story. By now it is August 25th of 1918. There are only a couple of months left in the war. And on that day, Jim Evans writes home to his wife. I'm going to read you just a couple of sentences from that letter. My darling girl, I am billeted in a chateau. Have a nice, comfortable bed. The grounds are very beautiful. The river Ancre runs through. Lots of trees, and it's laid out very nicely. We expect, however, and here he foreshadows the future, to move very shortly, and will probably be in the big push again before long. 6 days later, this news. A letter to Mrs. Evans. Dear Mrs. Evans, your husband was killed in action during the attack made by the battalion on the 1st of September. He was hit by an enemy sniper's bullet, and death was instantaneous. That happened just the other side of those woods. As it turned out, 960 Canadians fell on September 1st, 1918. It was the deadliest of the last 100 days of the Great War. And so again, the story of the advance to victory told in the cemeteries. Now, to the climax of our soldier's story. It is summer 1918, and Canada's pivotal role in the last months of the Great War is about to be realized.
John Girvan is in England at a senior officers' gathering, a time out from the fighting he uses also to get married. But a honeymoon is not to be. He's called back into battle, takes a command role in the final push, including at Canal du Nord. Girvan's heroics there, among the extraordinary acts of bravery key to breaking the German defenses.
The situation was critical, with Lieutenant Colonel Girvan striving to obtain order out of chaos.
Helping also to clear the path to the glorious prize, the reclaiming of the city of Cambrai. Looking around today, the finale, that rapid Canadian advance into a gutted city, a distant memory, until it comes back. The staggering cost, 46,000 killed, wounded, or taken prisoner. In 100 days, almost 20% of all the Canadian casualties of the entire Great War. Simon Godley has long been guided by the need to remember, never more so than right now, a century later.
We should be really trying to put a face on these soldiers. I've always enjoyed going out with people onto the battlefields where we have a photograph, you have a photograph, and it's putting a face. He's no longer stone, it's a face. And I think that is important. Lest we forget, it's not just a ritual, it is actually making an effort to really get behind the story and make these people come alive to folks again.
On November 11th, 1918, Girvan's Highlanders are in a community north of Cambrai. Rumors circulate early. A parade is called.
9:30. The bugle blew. The companies fell in, shuffled, stood easy. Major Girvan took over. A paper rustled in the waiting stillness. The major read the order to them, but all they heard was, "Hostilities will cease at 11 hours today." It was done.
Worn and faded, but forever part of history. This is that piece of paper. Indeed, the Great War is done. The victorious march home begins. Newspapers hail Major Girvan as a born soldier.
And that's exactly how I've always described him. It was like he was put on this earth for that reason. I mean, how do you survive a war like that? Through the whole thing, being shot and everything else, and gases, and then you still go on. I don't know. It's pretty amazing.
Frank Walker, the stretcher bearer and battlefield poet who simply ran out of words one day. Well, for him, the desire to write does return. He becomes a well-respected newspaper reporter, then editor, serving Charlottetown for more than half a century.
You know, they were just so anxious to go to the front. But then, as you see, as the time unfolds, then all that adventure and glory, he realized there's no glory to war.
And James Lloyd Evans, among all the unsung heroes who never made it back to families in Canada, the grandchildren he never knew, including Susan, who now visits and writes about the battlefields where he is buried.
I put a card down to say, I'm your granddaughter, something to that effect, and very grateful for your sacrifice.
More than 600,000 Canadian men and women served in the Great War. Nearly 1 in 10 were lost. Tonight, we've tried to put a face, a name, on a tiny fraction, because for every one of them, there is a path to follow, a story to tell. And every November 11th, we remember Canada's soldier.